Today, we're going to take a bunch of your questions about the Nikon Z system and the Z8 in particular. In the wake of the last couple of videos I've done, there have been a lot of questions. Today I'm going to be joined by my good friend and workshop coordinator, Rick LePage.
And Sony Guy.
To answer all your questions. It's Hudson. In the last couple of weeks, I've done a bunch of videos, a lot of stuff on Nikon Z8. There's been a lot of buzz about the Z8. I know a lot of people have been waiting for it. You think a lot of people have been waiting for it, Rick?
Yeah, but not in my house.
Well, Rick's really objective. As the Sony shooter, he is objective. And we're going to answer a lot of the questions I've been getting inundated with in email and in the comments on the YouTube videos that I've done. Really quick before we jump in and take your questions. And Rick's also going to keep me...
So many questions.
There's so many questions. But Rick's also going to keep me honest and kind of on track so that this doesn't go for 3 hours. Right? So I just want to point out that I did these videos. There's sort of a quick introductory review, my first impressions of the camera, as well as a full setup guide to all of the menu structure while you set up bank a standard bank, and then more detailed guide to how to set it up for some other functions. And those videos are linked in this video's full description. You can always just click and hit the link right here to the impressions guide one, or to those setup videos, but they're all linked in this video's description along with links to any accessories and the bodies and lenses that we talk about. Those links help us out, so thanks. And let's jump in and take some questions, Rick.
All right, well, you know, the big question I got is, how come you're sending the Z8 back?
You know, I think there's going to be so many people who get this camera in their hands, and kind of like when people first got the D850 in their hands, they're going to feel like this is the best camera I've ever had. It's the only camera I'll ever need, which is exactly how I felt when its big brother landed in my hands a little more than a year ago. And I thought at the time that maybe it was a little too big for me. Maybe I didn't need all the buttons and the extra grip on it, but I have fallen in love with the feel of this camera, particularly when I shoot with my 800 millimeter or my 100 to 400. And I'm just really used to it. And the fact is, this camera is, in all intents and purposes, an identical camera to the Z9. Same sensor, same image processing, same speed of handling, same autofocus tracking, same image quality. There's really, it's the same camera in a smaller package. And for me, you know, I always have more than one camera. I've been shooting a long time. But when I have a second camera to back up my main, I like it to do something a little bit differently. And for me, my Z6 II is smaller, it's lighter, it has a little better high ISO performance if I'm hand holding in low light conditions. So for me, it kind of wins the battle. And if I have to choose one of these to keep, it's a shock to me, but it's going to be the Z9.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. So is the Z8 really for that person who wants all of those features but just wants it to be a little bit lighter camera?
A little bit lighter, a little smaller, a little cheaper? Sure, exactly, yeah.
And really the only differences between the Z8 and the Z9 are fewer buttons, different battery.
Yep.
You know, and the weight is really the weight and size.
Weight, size, the loss of that vertical grip, unless you get this $350 vertical grip accessory, which is, it holds
$350?
$350, yeah. It holds two ENEL 15 batteries and charges them. So you can plug it in via power delivery in your bag. Gives you another USB-C port, which this camera already has two of. Gives you a vertical grip. But it doesn't replace the extra front function button or the whole array of customizable buttons across the bottom of the Z9. Some things I've just gotten used to. And it actually makes this camera significantly bigger than the Z9 when you put that grip on it. And it just doesn't feel as good in my hand. So there you go.
Some people who, you know, when they get in those special situations where they want to be doing that type of work, you know, they want more battery life, it's an easy enough thing to pop in.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and this camera's $1,500 cheaper than the Z9, so even with this, it's $1,150 cheaper than the Z9. And it's a handy, you know, the fact that it does charge batteries via power delivery from a USB battery bank, like this accessory that I recommend from Anker, which could charge maybe 4 of them, is pretty cool.
Okay, all right. So, you know, what I've seen just over the last few weeks is, you know, the Z8 is really appealing to two different groups of people. You know, I mean, people who've said, the Z9's not for me for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we got sort of the Z shooters, the Z6 and Z7 crowd. And then we've also got the DSLR, the D850 crowd. So, you know, looking at the Z7, and Z7 II specifically, you know, what's so special about the Z8 over the Z7 that's going to make someone really want to go jump to it?
Well, it's interesting, you know, I mean, I've had a lot of people draw my attention to, didn't Thomas Heaton say he's keeping his Z7 II and not going to embrace the Z8 for what he does? And I think that actually makes a lot of sense to me. It's sort of the same reason that I'm keeping the Z6 II as my backup camera. Now, my Z9 does a beautiful job with landscapes. It's a high megapixel count. It's got great dynamic range. It's got that Starlight view mode for shooting at night that's amazing. But the Z6 II, I'd have it in my hand right now, but I'm filming with it. It's a great video camera for me. It's a great lightweight camera when I travel with two. And if you're not someone who's shooting lots of sports action and wildlife, it does everything you need it to do. You know, it doesn't have as fast a frame rate by any stretch of the imagination. There's blackout when you're shooting action in between each frame when you're in the high-speed frame rates, which can be a little disconcerting, but it's something you can grow used to. I've done a lot of great action photography with my Z6, Z7, Z6 II, Z7 II, Z50 even, my little APS-C camera. But you have to work within its limitations a little bit. You have to learn to kind of get around that blackout. The fact that it isn't going to automatically detect eyes and faces of birds and other wildlife besides pets. It does great with humans. It does great with pets. But, you know, the Z8 and Z9 are your ticket if you like to shoot birds in flight and, you know, hippopotamuses racing from the water hole, or giraffes and zebras and all those different subjects. Cars, boats, planes, trains, motorcycles. It recognizes all those subjects and tracks them all over the frame with accuracy that will blow your mind at a really high frame rate.
I think one of the things that I would say about, you know, if you're coming from especially the Z7, and I agree with your thing about Tom Heaton, that the Z7 is still the best camera for him. Mm-hmm. But it's like when I got the A1, there was this whole world of shooting that I had no real concept about, you know, sort of action shooting and stuff like that. And it kind of rocked my world, especially with sort of, you know, the no blackout. You don't realize what a big deal that is when you were out shooting.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think no, I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I look at the two cameras, again, without having touched the Z8, but with your Z9 enough, you know, it's a big enough deal that it's going to change the way you shoot and what you shoot.
Yeah.
You know, so.
People who've never had success with photographing birds in flight are going to be giggling as they shoot birds in flight with it. You know, it has something that no other Z camera has. Oh, no other Nikon camera before the Z9 had, which is this newly created 3D tracking. They had something called 3D tracking in the DSLR age, but this is a whole nother thing. And it's the mode that I live in most of the time with these two cameras, where you just have a little square and it moves zippily all over the frame, anywhere you want in the frame. And if you put it on that person or that bird or that wild hyena, the camera knows, looking at the sensor, that's the subject. And as the subject gets bigger, it goes for the torso. And as the subject gets bigger, it goes for the head. And as the subject gets bigger yet, it locks on the eye, and you can pick which eye with the nudge of the joystick. It's crazy. And you know, as long as you hold the button down, you can select which subject's important to you in the frame with that point, and boom, you lock it. And then there are, you know, if you go into my settings menus, or my settings videos, I'll show you a hybrid way to take a larger square, that it's only looking for subjects within that big square for fast, erratic moving subjects. And you can lock it in that big square and then hand it off to that little 3D tracking that runs all over the frame looking for those intelligent features. And the eye at the end result is, as things get bigger in your frame, you're tracking the eyes, which is mind-bending. It's amazing.
So before we move on to the DSLR guy, is there anything else differently that you need to be thinking about moving from a Z8 or moving from a Z6 or Z7 up to a Z8?
Yeah, and let's call it Z50, ZFC, Z6, Z7, Z5.
Okay,
All the smaller Z cameras. This is sort of your middleweight Z cameras, and then you've got the big heavyweight Z9. They're identical. There's a few. I'd say the biggest thing is the 3D autofocus tracking and the fact that you want to be moving between which subject detection you're working with. It has an automatic subject detection, which looks for people first, animals second, vehicles third. But I would argue that you're going to want to use that 3D tracking and practice it. That 3D tracking is your bread and butter, and that's why when you go through my initial menu guide and the standard A-bank setup, that's my choice, is AFC and 3D tracking with back button. So if you don't want it to autofocus, you take your finger off. You don't need AFS that way.
Okay.
It's an amazing mode, and it's something that you're not going to have with any DSLR or any other Z camera, and that's the thing to be playing around with and learning how it works. There's a few things that you lose. We can talk about that maybe with the gripes, like you don't have exposure delay anymore, and you might have to change how you use bracketing a little bit. But other than that, I mean, that's the big game changer, the speed and the accuracy of the tracking.
Well, and some of that stuff was also applicable to the D850 DSLR user, but the differences there are much bigger.
Huge.
Than so.
Huge.
How, the big thing is going from a sort of clunky way to look at live view to this electronic viewfinder that's just nothing short of amazing.
Right.
But what else are you getting, moving from that D850 to the
any
Z8 or the Z9?
Any of the DSLRs.
Or any DSLR.
Any of the DSLRs. Yeah. Well, one thing you get is much more accurate autofocusing, just in general. Whether you're in AFC tracking subjects, like we've talked about, the fact that it'll pick up an eye and track it all over the frame, but also for someone who's a landscape shooter at their core like me, if you go into AFS and pinpoint autofocus, it will just nail focus, and you don't need to calibrate your lenses like you did in the DSLR age when they were calibrated to the rangefinder mechanism and the optical autofocus system to the distance scale in the lens. No, this is focusing on the sensor, and it's super accurate. The electronic viewfinder is such a big deal. You can't gloss over it. You suddenly, for someone like me who's aging into reading glasses, you don't need them anymore to work with this camera on the tripod. You can just use that electronic viewfinder with the diopter adjusted, and you can set your menus with it. You can review your images in it. You can zoom in to 100% during live view and check your focus and make sure that you've got the composition that you want all through that electronic viewfinder in dark conditions and see, because it's going to amplify the available light so that you can see your subject and apply the settings that you're putting with longer exposures. And I mean, I hate the cliche of game changer, but the electronic viewfinder is a huge game changer.
Yeah.
The fact that,
and I will say,
go ahead.
I will say, as a Sony user, it's the one thing I think that makes me most jealous about the Nikon world is that for astrophotography, the Nikon, the Z9 and now the Z8 are the pinnacles if that's the type of photography you want to go.
And we've seen people that we know switch completely, sell all their lenses and bodies from another brand to come over after watching me use the Z9 doing astrophotography on workshops, because its Starlight view amplifies the available light to the point where with a wide aperture lens, say this 21.8, or even the 14 to 24 2.8, the new amazing version of that lens, it amplifies the available light to the point where you can actually delineate between the horizon and the star field in Milky Way shooting and do your composition and see what you're doing. And at the same time, you can render everything in the display as red, this low-level red, so that you don't burn your eyes out looking at bright text and menu items on the screen. And you can use that AFS pinpoint autofocus that I described, zoom in on a star, put your point over the star in the zoomed in view, and lock focus on a star. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on, so is there anything else that you're going to be doing differently if you're moving from a DSLR?
You're gonna.
I mean, that's really the big thing.
You know, there are some who would disagree with me and say that in certain situations there might be a use for dynamic area autofocus, but I think you should at least wean yourself from it for as long as possible to realize. I mean, for decades, for well over a decade, I shot nothing but dynamic area autofocus with AFC basically on my DSLR. If I was going to do landscape, I'd go into the live view, zoom into 100% and accurately focus with the manual focus dial. When I was shooting action or anything else or handheld and using autofocus, I used AFC, dynamic, back button, and it was great in the DSLR age. It was fantastic. That focus mode has been held over. There is a dynamic area available on all the Z cameras, and it's a dumb autofocus mode. They tried to make it somewhat like the DSLR mode to be comfortable for DSLR shooters, but it doesn't look for eyes. It doesn't track subjects all over the frame. It doesn't do the same thing that the more advanced, I hate to use the AI, but the intelligent sensor-based subject detection and tracking that you get with this camera doesn't come with the dynamic area modes in this camera. So if you're coming from a D camera, flip it into 3D tracking, set that square over your subject and hit that back button and watch it morph between tracking the body, tracking the face, tracking the eye, and then suddenly realize, whoa, this is a powerful system.
Yeah.
Or the wide area. Wide area says, I only want things in this box, and there are all kinds of different shaped boxes. Some people like wide area small, some people like all these custom wide areas where you can delineate what you want the shape of the wide area to be. I like wide area large when I'm going to not use 3D. It's just a big box I can move really quickly around and say the top right of the frame's where my subject's going to be to try to lock. And then, like I said, in my setup video, I've even got a way to hand that tracked subject in the big box off to the one that goes all over the frame 3D style with just a button press on the camera.
Yeah. Okay. So the one downside, of course, coming from DSLR world is that you've got a whole bunch of these F-mount lenses. Mm-hmm. And, if you want to just automatically go full hog, you're going to end up spending a bunch of money on glass. The FTZ adapter, I've been watching you use that for a couple of years on some special lenses. How well does that work with the Z8 to Z9?
It works great. I had so many people in my Costa Rica workshop working with the 500 PF on an FTZ adapter. David Archer worked for a long time with the 500 PF on an FTZ adapter. You'll find that your very best Nikon lenses work just as well on, actually, all your old Nikon lenses are going to work just as well through the FTZ adapter. The thing that's going to surprise you is just how much better the new Z glass is. And the simple reason for that is this big, huge, wide mount. And the fact that the back of the lens is so much closer to the sensor. It just opens up opportunities for the optical engineers at Nikon. And they have charged through that door in a way that I, to be honest, haven't seen from a lot of the other brands. A lot of the other brands have great lenses and then sort of mediocre lenses, and I'm not going to name any names here. The Nikon lenses
better not be naming names on mine.
Yeah, the Nikon lenses have been pretty universally amazing. From even the little kit lenses that you can get with the Z50, the APS-C lenses. This is a 16 to 50. This is a 50 to 250. You put that into your to your full frame format, that's the equivalent of 24 to 375, and this whole kit costs about $1,000. And these lenses are great shooting into intense backlight, wide open. Yeah. I mean, they're just better. The lenses are just better. I would just challenge you to shoot your old 21.8 f lens, you know, the G lens against this new 21.8 S lens and look at the corners, shoot it at night in a star field wide open and notice that there's no chromatic aberration or coma and the stars are sharp and the extreme corners wide open at 1.8. This 14 to 24 is so much sharper from 2/3 out in the frame to the corners, all the way from, you know, wide open to f5.6 than the old one that I loved so much.
Yeah. Well, and yet you have your old 105 that you adore, you know, and you use the FTZ adapter on that, and I can't see you giving that up for a while.
No,
you know?
it's light. Compared to the 85-1.2 I took to Cuba and reviewed and sent back, that lens is amazing. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's way bigger than this. And this on the FTZ adapter, suddenly this old lens I loved on my F-mount camera gets in-body image stabilization where I can handhold this way slower than I used to be able to. And it also gets eye detect autofocus, which is so cool with a 105 1.4. It's like this lens is suddenly so much more useful on the Z camera, and I love it just as much as I did on my D850.
So how about these Z-mount lenses that are marked S? What's the difference between the SZ lens and the SZ
They're the
lens?
prestige lenses. All your top Nikon Z-mount lenses are going to be badged S. They have a little more durable build quality, a little more weatherproofing and weather sealing, and there may be just a slightly higher optical standard than the non-S lens.
Okay, all right. So without going too far down a rabbit hole, one of the things I keep hearing about is, and I've heard since the Z9 came out, is, you know, this whole concept of banks versus user settings, and they can be confusing, you know, and I know there's issues with them, but, you know, can you talk a little bit about the difference between them? And
I'll say,
again, like
I'll say briefly, because Rick's heard some tirades about all of this, that neither is a perfect system. They're both holdovers from the DSLR age that I think could be rethought. Both the user modes that were on the Z50 and Z5, 6, 7, all of those smaller bodies, and the banks, which are in the Z8 and Z9, both could be improved on. The user modes are true saved settings, the modes on the 6, 7, 5, the smaller Z bodies, but they're imperfectly integrated. There's some things about when you turn the camera on and off, resetting completely to all the settings, that should change. The Z8 and Z9's banks are like bookmarks. It's like having your camera in 4 different setups easily accessible at the same time. And if you look at my setup videos, which are linked in this video's description, I go through and I talk quite a bit about the banks in both videos, but particularly in the second shorter video where I set up bank B, bank C, and bank D after we go through all the menus and set up bank A as a base state. I'll show you in that video, despite the fact that these are bookmarks with no real save point, we'll show you how to use save settings to create your own sort of default state with this camera where it's the same when you pull it out of the bag every time, how to store those save settings and how to protect them from when you format your memory card. It really does, with the banks, give you the ability to set the camera up in 4 different shooting styles and modes that are fluid and work with you and aren't nuked when you turn the camera on and off or shift around. You can bounce back and forth between them and still be where you were 10 minutes ago in the given scenario that you're in. Then at the end of the day, you just reset your camera, format your cards, and store that base saved point again. I'll show you how to do all that in those videos. I think it's a better system, but I think it could be improved on yet. That's probably the topic for another video, but there you have it.
Okay. What about, did you have any other sort of real gripes about the Z8 or Z9?
Well, there are a few gripes I've had about all the Z cameras. As much as I love them and as impossible as it made it for me to go back to my D cameras when I got the original Z6 and Z7 for what I like to do, the Z8 and Z9 in particular, one of the things they got rid of that I loved was exposure delay mode, and I don't understand why it went away. It is now gone on both the Z9 and the Z8. It seems like they could bring it back via firmware, as many of us are upset about it. That was a mode where you push the shutter button, and if you had a camera with a shutter, it would open the shutter, wait however much time you said, read the image, and then close the shutter. With this camera, I think they decided, since there's no shutter to induce any kind of shake, they didn't need it anymore. But if you're doing an exposure between, a 15th of a second or even a 20th of a second and 2 or 3 seconds, that push of the button, maybe 10 seconds, that push of the shutter button induces shake in your system. And so, when we've complained about it, Nikon's response has been, well, there's no shutter in the camera and you have a timer mode. But for those of us doing, say, longer exposure panoramas in the landscape at blue hour, you got a 2-second shutter speed on every shot. It was so nice to set that exposure delay for a half a second. You push the shutter, take your hand off, click, move, take your hand off, click. You don't need a cable release or a remote control like this. The timer mode, the shortest duration timer is 2 seconds, which can seem an eternity if you're firing 20 frames in a panorama. And the little blinking, autofocus assist light goes whenever the timer goes. There's no way to shut it off, and then it goes solid before it clicks. And that can be super annoying in blue hour or night shoots. So basically, they force you to get a remote release, whether a cable release or I really like this little one from Velo, which I link in this video's description. It's simple. It's half the price of the Nikon one, and it's simpler than the Nikon one. You just plug it into the camera and push the button, and it fires the camera. So without a shutter, that's fine. You don't need a delay at all as long as you're not touching the button. Suddenly, the remote radio frequency trigger is just as good, if not better, but you have to get it, and you have to take the time to plug it into your camera in long exposure situations, which is annoying. That was one gripe.
So
I guess that's my biggest gripe. Yeah. That's my biggest gripe.
I have to say, it's a pretty small gripe. I mean, I've seen you out in the field. I know it's tough, but and I agree with you. I would.
Okay, the other biggest gripe, the second biggest gripe, is that whether you're using user settings on the mode dial with the other Z cameras, or whether you're using the banks with the Z8 and Z9, drive mode is not included. So you cannot store what drive mode you're in, whether you're in high-speed continuous, low-speed continuous, or single shot, with your bank settings or with your user mode, no matter what. So you need to flip into your action user mode on the Z7 and then select high-speed drive from the drive menu, or you have to flip into your bank B action settings and then flip into what the high-speed continuous on your drive mode. And that just seems like an oversight because they didn't put the drive mode in the shooting menu, the photo shooting menu. And if they literally altered that in firmware, it would fix the problem. So come on, Nikon, listen to that one. Stick the drive mode in the shooting menu.
That was one of my complaints. One of my complaints about the Z1 or the A1 as well was that. And
that's it. I mean that. There are some other little, but they're very niggling. And I think that whatever camera system you're shooting with, they're not perfect. When I spent a month with the R5 doing a review of it, amazing camera, some little really annoying features to it. The same thing when I've traded with you with the Sony A1, and I haven't shot the A7R5 that much, but every camera has little things that you're like, oh, I wish they'd done this differently. Every single one. So nothing major. And so you might notice a little skip here that we've had a cut, and that cut is because of the recording limitations of all the other Z cameras except for the Z9 and the Z8. For anyone who does video, the fact that these don't limit you to a 29-minute, 59-second clip is fabulous. It's one of my loves of these cameras, and it's one of the things that actually was the biggest pull for me to consider not sending the Z8 back and having it as my second camera.
I was going to say.
Is not having recordings time out at less than 30 minutes. So,
well, hopefully the Z6 III will get rid of that and you can replace it with that. So, all right. So I would agree from my perspective, my view on the world of the cameras right now. The Z8 and the Z9 really do seem like the pinnacle at this moment. The getting rid of the shutter, the the high speed modes, I mean, all of this great stuff. We have some of it in the
Pre-release
same mode.
capture, 8K
Canon's
raw
got some stuff.
footage, some of these crazy things they've added to it that most people don't need, but wow.
Yeah, right. So how do you see the Z8 and Z9 in comparison with the other big
Oh
camera
man,
guys?
I think they hold their own against any other system. You know, I've spent a lot of time with Canon's R5. I know the R1 is eventually going to arrive, and it'll be interesting to see how it changes the goalposts. And I almost wonder if the Z9, Z8 didn't kind of alter the release schedule of that camera a little bit. I've wondered because they talked about it coming, and then it's kind of been forever on the horizon. The A1 is amazing. You shot the A1 for a long time. We've traded cameras back and forth. I was blown away by some of its features. Some of the things that I love, like being able to set the autofocus point with your thumb on the back screen. The Canon R5 had that too. There's little things that each camera does that the others don't. And there's little things that each camera does that's annoying that the other camera doesn't. But I think whatever brand you're shooting right now, the latest cameras from that brand are flat, breathtaking, and amazing. You know, I'm always cautioning people. Some people think I might be some kind of Nikon cheerleader. Oh, you should switch to Nikon. I don't think so at all. I think if you love your Fuji camera and you know how to use it and you have all the memory function and menu knowledge that goes deep into that camera, you're gonna love the next one that comes out. The same thing's true of Sony. The same thing's true of Canon. The same thing's true of Nikon. You know, I remember people were so convinced Nikon was about to go bankrupt before the Z9 launched, and I've been there before too. I remember back in the day when Canon had the 5D and the 5D2, and we were still with the D700 and Nikon waiting for a camera that had more than 12 megapixels, and people were switching. And then Nikon came out with the D800, and it was like, whoa! People were switching to the D800 for all the dynamic range that bigger megapixel sensor had. And these brands leapfrog each other, but as a whole,
they do, but I would argue that one difference between that time and now is, people are selling a lot fewer cameras, so they've got to be on with the new cameras they come with. And we had, that pandemic, which, wreaked havoc on supply chains and things like that, and I think there was a lot of pent-up demand for Nikon to come out with the product that became the Z9, and I think they hit it out of the park. I kind of feel like Sony did that with the A1 when it came out. I remember getting that camera and thinking, my God, this is the best camera I've ever owned in my life. It's opened up whole new worlds of shooting that I never even really cared about before. And I agree with you. It's like, you could go into the Canon world, you can go into the Nikon world, you can go into any of these other worlds, find great stuff that will help you shoot what you want to shoot.
I agree.
I think that Sony is looking behind right now a little bit because the A1 is, 2 years old at this point, almost 3 soon. And it'll be interesting to see what they do. And I like this sort of leapfrog.
Yeah, it's like Android and iPhone. It's good for everyone. I mean, I think that
exactly.
One thing that Nikon's done really, really well was whatever fab built the sensor is pretty amazing. They clearly designed the specs that they wanted, and they got this sensor with, the stacked image sensor that does so much processing right close to where it's all happening to be able to create that level of data flow through the system. And then by using such fast architecture inside and card readers with the CF Express B, that they're offloading information at that 1600 megabytes per second that the best CF Express B cards are capable of, enables them to have headroom to grow and do things like raw 8K video recording and 120 frame per second JPEGs, where it's constantly overwriting the first 120, so that when you push the button, it backs up and stores the second before you pushed it. Crazy stuff like that. I think that Nikon has definitely led the way from a computer processing and data flow standpoint in the Z9 and the Z8 that others are looking up at right now. And I don't know how long that'll last, but they definitely set the goalposts out a little bit farther in terms of, what is this camera capable of And it's interesting. It's fun. It's,
Right.
you know, I know there'll come a time again where Canon or Sony look like they're so far ahead that people are calling for Nikon's demise. You don't think,
I don't. I think Nikon is
is.
just a smaller company. I mean, we've had plenty
Yeah.
of conversations about this. You know, Nikon is a smaller company. They've got to think a little bit differently. Sony is a consumer electronics company, you know, and Canon has always, you know, for the last 20 some odd years,
The
Canon
behemoth.
has been the 800-pound gorilla
Yep.
in the camera
And
business.
continue to be.
And, you know, yeah, and they have sort of that, you know, because they've got so much economies of scale that they can do things that Nikon can't do. Nikon can't afford to come out with, you know, five new camera bodies, you know, that are all sort of top level. They can't do that anymore.
Which is,
you know, I mean, you know, if you were going to pick one thing that you'd like to see Nikon do next, what would that be?
I would really love them to update. I mean, ideally both, but the Z7 III is something I think would probably be my next second body. You know, I'd like it to be in the same megapixel range as this or a little bit higher with great low light ability, which, you know, these cameras, given the potential that we have with things like DxO, Pure Raw 3 or Lightroom's new denoise in the develop module, you can squeeze amazing detail out of high ISO images, even if with a lot of megapixels. I'd like something with that, the kind of sensor that this camera has and that 3D tracking that just, you know, it just updates that a little bit. Subject detection that could be my second camera that also could, you know, when the bear comes and I'm backpacking with that lighter camera, I'd like to be able to have it track the bear's eyes automatically. That would be fantastic with 3D tracking. And also, I'd like for it to have the Starlight view and the warm display colors for Milky Way work, and have it also, you know, USB power delivery, 2 USB ports. So a lot of the things that the Z8 has, I'd like to see incorporated right on down. So, you know, I think that would be amazing. I think it's a big lift. Every time they develop something like that, it's a whole new stacked sensor that's going to, you know, they've got some of it built, but the stacked sensor is the hard part. I'd also like to see them do an APS-C. I'd like to see them do the Z6 III with that lower megapixel count, low light beast, you know, like Sony has done with the A7S series. You'll notice Sony's got the A7R5. They're not near the A7S5. You know, you've got to sort of pick and choose what's your highest priority, because it's expensive to do this kind of full research and design around a new sensor. One of the reasons why I think the Z8 is a mini Z9 is because it's probably cheaper for Nikon to do that than to build a whole new system for people with a different sensor and different architecture in it. It's cheaper as a whole to just do a couple slight modifications and squeeze this package into a smaller body.
Yeah. Well, and I think we're going to see more of that down the road. You know, the A7R5 has the same sensor as the A7R4. It's just all the extra stuff that they put in there, you know, the faster processor that you know, makes it such a great camera. You know?
I would love to see them do a really amazing, badass APS-C camera. You know, I love my little Z50, and my son has been shooting a ton with it lately, which is a lot of fun. And I recommend this camera constantly to people who say, you know, my grandchild is graduating from high school this summer and loves photography. What would be a great camera that they could grow with? You know, the fact that this camera has such a good viewfinder, it has all the autofocus tracking of the Z6, Z7, and that you can get this kit that goes from 24 to 375 effective focal length for $1,000. There's not a better deal out there. But I'd sure love to see a Z70 with some of the features like 3D tracking and more subject detection modes and a little faster frame rate, a little more megapixels. That'd be just amazing in a small little package like this, so that I could use these lenses with. That would be amazing. So
yeah,
it's kind of where I'd go. I truly think that the Z8, you know, if you don't have a Z9 and you're really serious about your photography and you love the idea of shooting wildlife and sports, this is going to be your favorite camera you've ever owned in your life if you're a Nikon shooter. You've been waiting for it, it's here. If you're a DSLR shooter and you've really been waiting for that camera to lure you and the Z9 seemed too big and heavy and expensive, but $4,000 is in your budget, it's a whole new world this thing's going to open up. And shoot with it at night, you're just going to be blown away. It's a lot of fun.
I say just
shoot with it.
Shoot with it.
You are. We are watching whenever we do a workshop, we create a WhatsApp user group and everybody can communicate with each other on that app, and then people stay in touch post-workshop, and ours are exploding right now with everyone receiving their Z8s and sharing images and being excited about their ability to track subjects in a way they haven't been able to before. And they're like giggling hordes filling our phones' notifications with WhatsApp messages from the Owens Valley workshop, from the Costa Rica workshop, from the Cuba workshop. It's fun. It's fun to see. So,
yeah. All right. Well, I think we got all of the main questions that people were asking about. So.
Yeah, I hope so. And remember, if you get in your camera and you want to learn a little bit more about it, I go probably into too much detail in those setup videos, and they're linked in this video's full description. So I hope that for those of you that are just jumping into mirrorless for the first time, you find it as dazzling and amazing as the rest of us have. I hope for those of you who are just getting a hold of the Z8 for the first time from the other Z cameras, I know you're just going to be like, wow, this was worth the wait. So leave us some comments. Leave us any questions that you have in the comments. Thanks so much, Rick, for moderating this. I know you kept me far more on track and focused, and it's a better video for it. And I can't wait. We're going to get out in Glacier here pretty soon. Oh,
yes, we are.
If you're not sick of talking about gear quite yet, this Tuesday, what is it, June 13th? I think it's June 13th. Rick can look it up while I talk. 10 a.m. Pacific, we're going to be having a big free-for-all Zoom meeting that's also available here on YouTube Live. So you can sign up for that at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. And we're going to talk about gear and take questions live. So you can join us on
your Sony questions.
Yes, bring your Sony, any kind of gear questions. It's all open game. So bring them and we'll talk, and we'll see you on Tuesday. All right, sign up at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. You can click to sign up, or you can just go down in the full video description and grab it. But it's also easy, hudsonhenry.com/office hours. All right, everybody, thanks so much for watching. Hope you're all having fun, staying safe. We'll see you next week.